first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about Judas. Hey. So note at Luke 22, 3 through 6. Luke 22, 3 through 6. It says, Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. All right, so note, first of all, obviously, again, we've talked about this in the past. They didn't have last names in this time period, right? And so you have Judas Iscariot. And so, honestly, we don't know exactly what Iscariot means. It is most likely that it means son of Carioth, which means he's from Carioth, because note that in John 13:26, his father is referred to as Simon Iscariot, right? And so they're both referred to in the same way, so it seems most likely it's where they're from, and so it would be Judas of Iscariot, right? And you get an example of that we know for sure in Mary Magdalene, right? So Mary Magdalene, again, that's not her last name. It is literally Mary of Magdala, or Mary the Magdalene, and that's where she's from, Magdala, right? And so we know that for sure. But since both of their names are that, it seems more likely that it's where they're from. And Carioth seems to be the best possibility. Again, and we've talked about this before, I think, but there is a theory that it's actually, at some point in time, the spelling got corrupted, and it's actually Judas Iscariot, which would just be a transposition of two letters. And that would associate him with the Sicarii men, who were basically assassins. And they would assassinate Roman officials and such. And you say, well, that sounds crazy that Jesus would have somebody like that. But he has Simon the Zealot, for sure. And the Zealots were similar, right? And so that doesn't mean that they're doing that stuff while, they're in Jesus' ministry, obviously. But it's where they came from. However, again, the fact that both his father and he are referred to in the same way, it seems more likely that it's where he's from. And doesn't have anything to do with the misspelling or anything like that. But if you ever hear that, that's where they get that from. So this whole idea of Satan entering into him. Note that Luke seems to be tying back to Luke 4:13, where it says, And when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time, right? And so it's not that Judas is possessed by the devil. Like and we often think that. We often think in terms of being possessed, and then you're doing stuff that you can't really control. So the problem with that interpretation, if you hold that, is that then it takes away Judas's responsibility, right? But clearly the New Testament authors make him responsible for what he's done. So it's not like Satan has possessed him and then forced him to do something that he wouldn't normally do, right? And so what seems to be going on here is that Satan finds an end where his will and then Judas's will converge, and so he's able to use what Judas is doing to his benefit, right? Because again, he thinks that killing Jesus is the thing to do, right? And again, that's one of the theories of why Jesus is so secretive, right? Because you think, like, why didn't he just come out and say stuff? And he even says that he speaks in parables on purpose so that people don't understand, right? And I think there he's saying, if people aren't willing to figure out what I'm saying and to actually, study the scriptures and figure me out, then they're certainly not going to be willing to die when things get rough. And so I don't have time for those people to be involved, right? So it's like he's sifting the people that want to follow him and getting only the people who are willing to really try. But then you say, well, the disciples, they still didn't understand him, right? Why does Judas betray Jesus, right? And so, again, it's not clear. Is it money? Well, the money that he receives is basically a month's wages, right? And so, again, he may be a terrible guy, But would he betray this Jesus guy who's performed miracles and stuff in front of him for a month's wages? He might. And listen, we don't get to know what Judas is thinking as far as why he does what he does. It is possible though, and there's another theory, and again, all of this is speculation. The other possibility is that he believed, again, as everybody else did, that Jesus was going to be a human warrior who was, Messiah, who was going to come in and kick out the Romans. And when he's talking about love and peace and all this stuff, and my kingdom's not of this world, Judas is like, well, wait a minute, this is not what I signed on for. And either he betrayed him, one of the theories is that he betrayed him in order to strike up the fighting, so that when they came to arrest him, then he has to fight, or he became disillusioned with Jesus' ministry, and he said, you know what, I don't want to get arrested with Jesus because I'm not even involved anymore. So then he goes and sells him out in order to, distance himself from it. But listen, all of that is possibility, but we don't know for sure, right? But again, Satan did not possess him and force him to do things that he didn't want to do. He's responsible for what he did, and he did it, right, for whatever reason. I will say again, and again, we've talked about this in the past, if you ever watch the Discovery Channel, they used to, and I don't know if they do anymore, they used to have a whole lot of interesting, Bible shows and stuff, but, they would have like banned from the Bible and stuff like that, and it's writings that aren't in the Bible. They weren't banned from the Bible. They were never put in the Bible in the first place, and they weren't put in the Bible because they didn't meet any of the criteria used for canonization. So, for instance, there is a Gospel of Judas, right? And so if you read the Gospel of Judas, you can buy a copy of the Gospel of Judas, or you can buy the Gnostic Gospels, and it has all the Gospels in it, or all the Gnostic texts in it. And in that story, it says that Judas was actually the best disciple, right? Like he was the closest to Jesus. And then Jesus comes to Judas and he says, hey, I need you to do me a favor. And Judas is like, oh, I'll do anything you want. And then he's like, I need you to betray me so that I can be crucified. And then that'll save everybody. But then you can't tell anybody, right? And so Judas is like, oh, well, that sounds bad, but I'll do it because I'm the best, right? And so again, why does that book not go in the Bible, right? So you say, well, the Gospel of Judas, it's the Gospel of Judas. Surely it should be in the Bible. No, because of many reasons. One, it is written too late, because these are I'm giving you the criteria for canonicity, right? The first one is that it's written too late, right? After the events of the New Testament, period. And so it's in the 2nd or maybe even the 3rd century, right? So we say, no, it's written too late, too far away from the events that actually happened. The second is that it clearly goes against the teachings of the New Testament documents, particularly the Gospels, that we do know fit all of the criteria for canonicity, right? So if it goes against what we know, obviously it shouldn't be in there. And then the last is we don't know who wrote it, and so and it's written late, so it had to have been written by somebody late, and so it's not written by one of the apostles or someone close to one of the apostles, right? Which was the third criteria, right? So it's too late. It goes against known theology that was considered, standard theology. And then it's not written by an apostle or someone close to an apostle, right? And so books like that, they're not banned from the Bible. They didn't meet those criteria to get in the Bible in the first place. So that story, whatever reason somebody decided they wanted to write that story, is fictitious and does not, it would not go in the Bible. And it's not because Constantine, decided what was going to be in the Bible. That is not the way it worked. It was a very, particular method. Constantine really had nothing to do with it other than getting everybody together. And so that's that. All right, John 13:18. Jesus says, I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. Right? So again, he's talking about Judas, but he's quoting Psalm 41:9, which would be a psalm of David, where David is also talking about people betraying him, right? So it's when his kingdom is coming crashing down and he's being betrayed. He's betrayed by his own son and others have betrayed him. And so he's talking about that. But note, they're in a similar situation, right? And so John uses that passage as well. John 13:19 through 30, and I'm going to read this through kind of fast. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. So note that Jesus will oftentimes tell things that are going to happen in the future so that when they do happen in the future, it's not like Jesus was surprised. It's like, listen, these things are going to happen and they're going to be surprising to all of you, but I'm telling you they're going to happen now. Like he tells them several times, the Son of Man is going to Jerusalem to die, right? And they're like, he didn't really mean that, right? Because, and so then when it happens, even then they still don't believe. They're like, well, that's crazy. And then they go about their business. But he tells them things so that he's not taken by surprise. It's just like God in the Old Testament who talks about the fact that the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all of those things that are going to happen with them, so that when it happens, they don't think, well, Yahweh was taken by surprise and, he's not powerful because the Assyrians came in and destroyed, his northern kingdom, and then the Babylonians came in and destroyed the southern kingdom. And God is like, no. I told you this was going to happen a long time ago, and it's not because I was taken by surprise or I wasn't powerful. It's because you needed to be judged, and I chose to use those nations to judge you. Well, Jesus does the same thing, right? He tells them things that are going to happen so that when it happens, they will look back and say, hey, you know what? Jesus told us this was going to happen. So at John 13:19 through 30, I'm telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. Again, remember, because the way they eat is they're laying on their side and they're eating with their right hand and they're looking around the table at each other. They didn't have chairs because you don't have really room to store chairs. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. Right? So this all seems very obvious, right? So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, right? There's the Simon part. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do quickly. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night, right? So note that this all sounds very obvious. Like everybody is just sitting there quiet, and Jesus is speaking to them, and then it's like, well, who's going to betray you? And it's like, the person to whom I give this bread, Judas. And everybody's like, right? But then clearly they don't understand after the fact. They're like, wait, what's going on? So why is that? Well, first of all, there would likely be many people at this still, right? We're on a roof of a house, right? So it's the upper room, which we'll talk about a little later, but it's the upper room, which means it's on the roof, okay? So they're eating on the roof, and you certainly have his 12 disciples, but you would likely have other people there as well, including his female disciples. They may have multiple tables. You would have lots of conversation going on and all of these different things. Generally, what you would have in this time period is you would have U-shaped tables, low tables, where they would recline up to those tables, and you would have potentially 3 people at each one. And so if it's John and Jesus and Judas at one table, and then other people at other tables, and he's speaking, notice it says that Peter motioned for him, right? So Peter could be a distance away, like saying, hey, ask him who. But it seems like there's a lot of things going on, right? So that's why in all the different versions, they don't just look at Judas and tackle him down, right? Because it's like, well, he's going to betray him. They clearly don't see what's going on. And then, of course, he goes and he betrays him. Okay, Matthew 27:3-5, it says, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind. So again, it's his mind doing this, and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself, right? And so note that this could be an indication that Judas thought things would turn out differently, right? And so when he took the money and everything, maybe he thought something else was going to happen, again, a fight or something. And then when it didn't happen, then he felt bad or whatever. But again, we can't know exactly what his inner thoughts were or, what he was thinking at the time. All right, a few notes on the Last Supper. Note that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. And so note that at this Passover meal, Jesus is presented as the Passover lamb, which was provided for salvation from death and ushered in an Exodus event in the book of Exodus, right? And so it's, again, remember, it commemorates when death passed every house and protected the firstborn of those who had the blood, right, on their doorposts. And so here you have a similar situation where you have Jesus as the Passover lamb whose blood is going to protect them from death, but spiritual death this time, right? And then his body that he talks about will be eaten, right? And that created a lot of confusion. His body is symbolic again of them eating that Passover meal, right? And so then you have the new Exodus, which is an Exodus to save us, not from slavery to the Egyptians in this case, but slavery from our fear of death and all of that, right? And sin. And so that's what this whole scene is presenting to you, is a Passover meal where we are celebrating the fact that we are saved from death, but spiritual death, and that we are going on an exodus, but it is a spiritual exodus where we're no longer, we're exodus from death and sin, all right? Again, note that the Last Supper, which is the upper room, right, would have been likely eaten on a roof. So you had, again, a very, modest house that had maybe 2 rooms in it. Remember, you had the area in the back where we keep the animals that had that's where Jesus would have been born, at his family's home. We talked all about that. He's not born in a barn out in the middle of nowhere. He would have been in the family home, in the back, in a manger where they would have kept the animals, so she wasn't in the middle of everybody. And so if you needed to have a bunch of people, then you might do that on the roof, because that's another place that you had. And so they made houses so that you could go on the roof. All right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but note that Peter's denial of Jesus, of course, he denies Jesus 3 times. And then at John 21:15 through 17, he gives him 3 opportunities to basically take that back, right? To cover his 3 denials, because he's the guy that's going to be the backbone of the church at this point, and so he's given that opportunity to take back those denials. It's also 3 opportunities to confess his love, right? And so and that shows the necessity of the all-encompassing love and loyalty in the face of what Peter is going to face himself in his future persecution, right? Oftentimes you will hear, because there are 2 different words that are used in these 3 deals, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but just note that is not interpretively important, right? Some people will say, well, it meant, he asked him if he loved him this much, and then this much, but then he only loved him this. It's not really anything like that. That happens in ancient literature and Judaism, where you have a synonymous word used to add variety to what's being told. And so again, he asked him if he loves him 3 times in order to cover that initial 3 denials, right? And then again, it does show the fact that he must love him, to a high extent in order to suffer what he is going to suffer. All right, the coming of the Holy Spirit. At John 14:15 through 17, it says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever. Even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you." At John 16:5 through 15, it says, "But now I am going to him who sent me, and none of you asked me, 'Where are you going?' But because I have said these things to you, sorrow has filled your heart. Nevertheless, I tell you the truth. It is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you." Again, the Holy Spirit. And when he comes, I will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness and judgment. Concerning sin, because they do not believe in me. Concerning righteousness, because I go to the Father, and you will see me no longer. Concerning judgment, because the ruler of this world is judged. Notice the ruler of this world, Satan, is being judged now, again, through what Jesus is going to accomplish and what he is now accomplishing. So it's at his death and resurrection, again, that Satan loses his access to heaven, right? I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak. And he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, for he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has in mind is mine. Therefore I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. Right? And so what is this about the Holy Spirit? Like, what is the deal? And obviously, we have a general idea. But one part of that is the idea of God's desire to be with his people, right? God desires to be with his people. So you have in Eden, for instance, you've got Eden. God is literally with his people, right? But then, you have evil and all of that happens and death. And so then you have God in the tabernacle, right? So then God is with his people eventually again when they're in the tabernacle. Then you have God with his people in the temple, right? But then he leaves the temple in Ezekiel. Ezekiel sees that happening before the Babylonians come in, right? So then you get to the New Testament period and you have this whole new deal where you have Jesus, God with us, who is literally hanging out with people on the earth in a human body, right? So you have that. Then you have Jesus crucified and resurrected. So then what are we going to do? Then you have the Holy Spirit, which again is God with us, but even more intimately internally, right? And so God is constantly wanting to be with his people. It's described as tabernacling with his people throughout the Bible. And this is just an extension of that. Then again, of course, Jesus will return and he will set up his rule on the new heavens and the new earth, and he will be literally there with his people again. Note that the Holy Spirit is referred to as he. And so it is a personal being, right? It's not just, again, it's the Trinity. It is part of God, right? And so it's not just a magic or something else. It is a literal personal being, right? And it's, again, part of the Godhead. It's part of the Trinity. All right. Note that Christians will suffer, okay? John 15, 18 through 21 says, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you, right? Because the world does not like to hear what it's doing wrong. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. John 16, 1 through 4. He says, I have said all these things to you to keep you from falling away. Again, telling them what's going to happen beforehand so they're not taken by surprise. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. Think, for instance, Paul, right? Paul thinks that he's doing a service to Judaism by killing Christians. And then, of course, he comes to a rude awakening. And they will do these things because they have not known the Father nor me. But I have said these things to you, that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told them to you. I did not say these things to you from the beginning because I was with you, right? But it's after that he says them. Now to 31 through 33, Jesus answered them, do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And then you get in the high priestly prayer of Jesus to the Father for his disciples. He says, but now I am coming to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. Talking about the disciples. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. And so what he is asking is safety for his disciples as they work amongst the ungodly, right? Because again, in the first century, they go through horrible tortures, right? And we've talked about this in the past, and particularly when we did the Revelation Bible study. Again, and the problem is, in the United States, we don't have persecution. So it's hard for us to understand what's going on here, right? We think, well, we're waiting for things to get bad. Well, things are bad all over the world in other countries and stuff. They're just not bad for us because we're pretty well insulated, right? And so we don't really have this whole idea of persecution. When you look at what happened to Israel, which again, I know they're not Christians, but when you see what happened in Israel and all these horrible things that happened, it opens your eyes to what's going on around the world and the different things that people will do that's evil. Well, those things happen to Christians as well. And in the first century, before John wrote his book, there are people being ripped to shreds in the Colosseum by wild animals, right? Again, I read a story, and I don't remember her name, but there's one account of one of her disciples, if you will, one of her friends, where a woman is in the Colosseum, and I think she's shielding another woman, if I'm not mistaken, who has her baby, and she is trying to protect the other woman with her baby as wild animals are ripping them apart, right? This is the type of persecution that Jesus is saying that they're going to suffer. And they suffered it in the first century. And they went through that and they kept their faith. But there were many who did not keep their faith, right? And so this is what he is warning against, or for all time, is that, hey, you have to stay faithful. You are going to suffer persecution, right? And again, people have suffered for Christianity throughout history, sometimes at the hands of other Christians, right? When the Protestants and the Catholics were going after each other, and they were both equally horrifying, they killed each other and tortured each other to make them, go to the other side, right? Which they tortured, people over things that we look at as just a minor denominational issue, but they killed each other for it. So don't let our relative comfort make you look over the fact that tribulation and stuff that Jesus says is going to happen has happened throughout history. Don't think, well, I've never seen tribulation, so therefore it's not happened yet. No, it's definitely happened throughout history. Now, does that mean that there's going to be a future time of tribulation that's going to get really bad again? And yeah, absolutely, that's certainly likely. But don't dismiss the tribulation that's happened to people throughout history. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. And willing to die is the point that he's making, right? That they are so engrossed in the gospel and what I have taught them that when it comes time for them to die, they will die in truth, right? And again, there were some people who did not. But interestingly, if you read through church history, there was a movement after, I think, into the second century, where people purposely put themselves in harm's way because they wanted to be martyred for Jesus and Christianity. And so they had to come, the early church had to come in and say, no, don't go get yourself killed on purpose. Like, that's foolish. Don't do that. You don't want to purposely get killed. But if you do get arrested and you get killed, then you stay faithful. But you had several people who went out and thought, well, because Jesus said that we might be killed, if I get killed, then that's going to be even better for me because, man, look how good of a Christian I was. No, your job is to go spread the gospel. That's what is important. And then if you die doing that, then so be it. You get your eternal reward. Stay faithful. All right, Jesus' internal struggle at Matthew 26, 36 through 46. It says, then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Right? And so note that Jesus himself, and we're going to finish, so we're going to finish. Jesus himself has doubts about what he has to do simply because nobody wants to go to a horrifying death, right? But the thing that, of course, makes him special in the fact that he actually did it is that he says, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So in other words, he's living what he just said. Even though this is going to be a horrifying experience for me, I'm going to die. And if that's your will, Father, then I'm obviously willing to do that, right? And of course he does. And that happens. And I'm not going to read the rest of that because for time. But it's you get the picture. And then of course his disciples, they're still asleep and they can't stay up. So all right, Jesus' arrest and trial. The trial of Jesus. I'm going to go over a passage and then we'll talk a little bit about what the trial would have looked like. And I say a trial, it's a backroom deal in the middle of the night. It's not a real trial, right? It's not an official trial. But at John 18, 3 through 6, it says, so Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, so again, he knows that this is all going to happen. He's not taken by surprise, came forward and said to them, who do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground, right? So note, that's odd, right? So it's like, he's using the force, right, or whatever. So why is that? Why would they fall to the ground? Are we to understand that Jesus literally somehow makes them fall to the ground with some sort of power or whatever? Because then he just answers them after this and then gets arrested, right? So it's not like he's fighting back. So what is that all about? Well, note that the literal rendering of Jesus's answer is I am, right? And so we've talked about this in the past. Remember, throughout the Gospel of John, and Zach preached on this several months ago, but these I am statements are pointers saying that Jesus is the I am of Exodus 3:14 when God is in the burning bush. And that's, again, I am who I am is grammatically by way of a different form of a word, is where we get the personal name of God, Yahweh. And so what Jesus is saying to them is, I am God, right? And so, of course, it says I am he in the English translation, but that's just supplied by context, right? So they ask, where is Jesus, or who is Jesus of Nazareth? He says, I am, right? And then it's assumed he's saying, I am he, or I am the one you're looking for, or whatever it may be. But that I am statement is a definitive statement and revelation of Jesus' divinity, right? And so for those who knew of the miracles and things that he had performed and the different, things, like it'd be like if you called the police and they came, well, they have to come, but if they get there and they're like, well, I've seen this guy perform like miracles and stuff, like, this is kind of scary. And then he says, hey, I'm God. And then you're like, and then you fall down, because they're like, it says they stepped back and they fell down, right? So it seems to be that they're, that they have some fear. Note that Jesus seems to have this effect on people, because at John 7:45 through 46, it's the chief priests and Pharisees send some officers to arrest him then. And it says the officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why did you not bring him? The officers answered, no one ever spoke like this man, right? So they're like, we got there and he was talking and we were like, I don't think I want to put my hands on this guy, right? And so it's a similar idea. 18:7 through 11. So he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go. Looking out for his disciples, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And note, again, Peter still misunderstands Jesus' mission. He also thinks this is the time to fight, right? And so he's like, okay, we've got to fight. Jesus saying, no, I was never going to fight. All right, where does Jesus go? He ends up going to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is the Jewish council, Jewish court, if you will. And so the Sanhedrin is made up of mostly Sadducees, which are what we would consider, I hate these terms, but it would be more the liberal party. So again, they didn't believe in supernatural deals. They didn't believe in angels. They believed in the law. They were highly Greek influenced. They liked Greek culture. But they also had some Pharisees on the council, because the Pharisees were what we would call the conservatives, and they were the party of the people, because the people wanted to be conservative and they didn't like Greek culture. The Pharisees were that way. They didn't like Greek culture and such. So they go to this back room where you have what appears to be the Sanhedrin, or members of the Sanhedrin, who were against Jesus. They basically call him guilty, and then they take him and then have him eventually crucified, of course. There are 70 members. There's 70 members of the Sanhedrin. 71 if the high priest is in attendance, which in this case the high priest is there, but the rest of the Sanhedrin is not there. It's not a legitimate deal. So then you have Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Note that the Jewish officials use political strategy in order to get what they want. So therefore, at Luke 23, 4 through 5, it says, "Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, 'I find no guilt in this man.' But they were urgent, saying, 'He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place.'" And so what they're saying to him is, well, he's going to cause a riot. And he's telling people he's the king of the Jews. If you don't do something, then you're going to get in trouble. And as we talked about before, Pilate had already been warned that if there is more rioting in his area, then he would be recalled to Rome, which he then is eventually after a riot in 36 AD, where he is recalled in 37 AD. And then we don't know what happened to him after that. So they're using that against him, saying, you better do something. So Pilate entered his headquarters at 1833, again, and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Because what Pilate's thinking is, Herod Antipas is king of the Jews according to Caesar. So are you saying that you're the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Notice again that he's highly anti-Semitic. He did not like Jewish people. He's killed many of them before this time. Jesus answered, I am at John 18, 36 at this point. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world," right? So then he's given Pilate an out, because he's like, well, no, I'm not talking about I'm an earthly king. And he's like, oh, well, is that all, right? Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born. For this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." So note that the truth of which Jesus speaks is God's revelation of his covenant character, right? So he's like, I'm here to bear witness to the truth. And the truth is how God treats his people. And Jesus embodies how God treats his people. At John 1:14, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory as the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." John 14:6 says, Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so the ultimate expression of God's covenant faithfulness will be Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Just like the ultimate expression of God is Jesus himself. Because he literally, when you're talking to Jesus and he's doing things, it's God doing those things, right? And so he is the ultimate expression of God. Whereas in the Old Testament, the law was the expression of God to the people. Here you have God himself in human form as the ultimate expression of God. When Pilate hears what Jesus says, he hears that Jesus is a philosopher who deals in abstract questions of truth and is therefore no threat to Rome, right? That's what he would have heard. So therefore, that's why he argues that in terms of philosophical truth, there is no objective truth to be determined by philosophy. And if you read philosophy today, there are still, from that time to now, there are still people who believe that exact same thing. They say, hey, there's no such thing as truth. That's why we're in trouble today with some of the junk we see on the news, right? It's like, well, you say this is happening, and you look at this event, and you say, well, this is what I think. And then I look at the event, and I say, well, I think this. But we're both equally right, because there's no truth, right? Well, that's ridiculous, right? In some cases, we may be able to interpret things differently, but ultimately, in general, there's truth. We can look at something and we can say a spade's a spade or whatever, right? And interestingly, more so, or scary, I guess, there is even an interpretive method of interpreting the Bible called reader response theory, right? And it means that, or its theory is that when you read the Bible, whatever you think it means, that's what it means to you, right? When you hear people say, on the news, they'll say, well, I was speaking my truth, right? Well, what that's saying is, well, that's what it means to me. Well, what does it really mean, right? And that's kind of what we do in here, right? We look at the context, and in the Bible, we say, well, what did it mean to those original hearers? That's what it meant, right? And generally, we can get to what it meant. And we don't look at it and we read it and we say, well, I think it means this, and I think it means that. And again, in some places where there are interpretive issues, we can certainly do that based on information from the text. Well, the text here seems to say this, but the text here seems to say that. I'm getting both of those from the text. I can't just say, well, I think that fairies or whatever, right? You can't just decide crazy stuff, but that's my truth, right? I hate that. That's my truth. It's just like, it just says it's whatever I believe, that's just what it is. Well, that's ridiculous. Sorry. John 19, 7 through 12. Okay, notice I am going to read that first part. It says, the Jews answered him, we have law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Pilate was afraid because they said that he was the Son of God. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? So why? Why does that matter? But Jesus gave him no answer, right? And then he goes on and he says basically at the end, at 12, he says, from then on, at 11, Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you, Judas, has the greater sin. And it may even be, he could be talking about the Jewish officials, but he says him specifically. So it could be Judas. I would assume Judas. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release the man, you are not Caesar's friend. Again, using politics. Why is Pilate scared? Because again, as a good Roman, and we think this is ridiculous today because we don't think like this, he believed in the Greco-Roman gods, and he understood that there were people like Hercules that had lived and different demi-human god people, right? And so he's thinking, if he comes from God, if he's the Son of God, then, or a God even, then he might be a divine man, and if I do something bad to him, then his father, whichever God, might do something bad to me, right? And so he's clarifying with Jesus, like, who is your father and where did you come from? Like, are you saying that, and note that Jesus lets him off completely. He says, look, don't worry about all that. My kingdom is from above. You're not any more guilty than anybody else. Just let it go, right? And they let it go. All right, the crucifixion. All right, so what is this about crucifixion? If I am the Roman army and I go through a place, okay, let's say that, God forbid, we're here in Morris and we go and we fight Warrior, right? And we go in and we fight Warrior and we assert our authority and we kill a bunch of people and stuff. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take people who survive, we're going to whip them, and then we are going to hang them in the trees, okay? And with the way we would do that, generally, we're not going to waste nails on people because nails are expensive. And so we're going to have whipped them good enough to where they're going to bleed pretty badly. We are going to hang them by ropes like this in the trees, and their bodies are going to hang like this, which is going to cause you not to be able to breathe. and then your lungs will eventually fill up with fluid, and then you will die, okay? Now, in a place like Jerusalem, where you have a contingent of troops, we would have ready-made pillars in order to crucify people, right? Because what all this means is when I come through and I look and see all these people crucified, I'm like, oh, I don't want to mess with the Romans, or whichever empire it was before that. I certainly don't want to mess with the Romans. And so in Jerusalem, what they would have had is they would have had the pillars in the ground. Jesus would have carried his cross, which would have literally been the crossbeam, right? And so he would have carried that crossbeam, which would be like carrying a railroad tie, and you would carry that, which again would be horrifying, after you'd been whipped and all these other things, and or scourged, not whipped, scourged, which means it had metal or bone pieces in it, right? And so you would take that, and then they would lift you up and lock you in to the pillar that was already there. It would be a capital T cross, not a lower T cross like we see today. Like when we think of Christianity, we think of a lowercase t. It would have actually most likely been a capital T. You would have been pulled up there. In this case, nails would have been used because they can get them back out, and we're going to stay here so we can pull the nails out. We actually have a foot bone that has a nail in it still because the end of the nail bent, so they couldn't pull it back out. And so we have a foot bone that has a nail in it where someone was crucified, right? And so if they gave you sometimes they would give you a peg to stand on, and then sometimes they would nail your feet in, like in that case of that person who was crucified. And let's say they gave you a peg and you're like, oh, how nice, they gave me a peg to stand on. Not nice. What that does is you stand on that peg until you can't stand anymore, and then your body sags, and then you can't breathe. And so you stay in that position until you can't breathe. Then you stand again to try to get some comfort until your legs give out again. Then you're hanging, then you're standing, then you're hanging until eventually your lungs fill up with fluid and you die, you suffocate. It's a horrifying death. That's why they came at the end of the night and they broke the ankles. And they didn't break Jesus' ankles, of course, because he was already dead, because it then makes them hang and they die quicker, right? And so that's what they wanted, the Jews wanted. So that's what crucifixion would have been like in Jesus' situation. Note that at John 19:17 it says, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of skull, which is Aramaic, is called Golgotha. And again, it's the crossbeam. All right, note, and I won't read it, but note that Pilate has put on the cross King of the Jews, and he puts it in 3 different languages. And note that the Jewish officials come to him and they say, hey, take that off. He's not the King of the Jews. He simply said he's the King of the Jews. And he says, I'm leaving it there, right? And again, he's anti-Semitic. Very likely the reason that he didn't want to crucify Jesus in the first place was just to jerk them around, right? Because he doesn't like the Jewish people. And if they want this guy crucified, then he doesn't want to do anything good for them, so he's like, nah, I'm not going to do it. They use political leanings to make him do it, and so then he eventually does it. Jesus' mother and son right there, not Jesus' son, right? Jesus' mother and then her new son, right? Her son who adopts her as mother. At 19:26, John 19:26, it says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Note that this is the closing to the opening of Jesus' ministry, which also involved Mary at John 2:4, when she asked him to help out with the wine that they had run out of. And it says, and Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And woman seems pretty strong there, but it would be like us saying ma'am today, or madam, something like that. And so his hour had not yet come then, but now his hour has arrived and is almost completed. And so he is taking care of his mother, both physically and spiritually at the same time, by basically giving her over to John to be adopted. And you say, well, wait a minute, Jesus had other brothers. Yes, and they were not Christians. And so Jesus felt so strongly about it that he would rather have John adopt her than one of his non-Christian brothers, because they don't believe until after they see him resurrected from the dead, right? Clearly says that his brothers were unbelievers. It says it in that passage there, but I didn't read it. Note, too, that it would have brought shame on the entire family that he is crucified. You say, well, what about Joseph? Joseph is apparently dead by this point, right? We don't know anything about Joseph after Jesus is 13, and so it is assumed that he has passed away. All right, and then again, I just want to point out that when Jesus says, my God, why have you abandoned me?" At Matthew 27:46, he is quoting Psalm 22:1, which starts out that way, right? But then note that the rest of the psalm goes on to talk about the Lord's provision and how God helps David, you assume, out of his situation and helps him. And so when Jesus says this first part of the psalm, it's assumed that his Jewish hearers would have had the entire psalm in mind. And so they would have understood that ultimately from this, Jesus is saying there will be, God will come in and he will take care of things. And again, it's through the fact that there will be salvation. And so he would have had the entire context in mind. We talked about that when we did that in the Old Testament passage. All right, and then the last thing. The curtain tears and the dead are risen at Matthew 27:50 through 53. And there's darkness. Notice that darkness would normally be seen by Gentiles as judgment, but it could also be a sign in Judaism of a great person dying. But it also alludes to the plagues of Egypt, right? When the sun is blotted out, right? And so you have that. Note that the temple curtain would be the veil that shields the priest from seeing inside the Holy of Holies, right? Which is where God's presence is. And so by that curtain being torn, again, it's saying God's presence is not here in this temple. It is in Jesus, right? And so there's nothing to look on in that temple. It's now Jesus that you need to look on. This temple is not going to do anything for you, right? No, I thought there was another part that I was going to read to you, but there's not. And it's no longer the mode of worship of Yahweh himself. Jesus is now that mode of worship. Note that the resurrection of many bodies of the saints, it just for the record, I'm not going to be able to tell you some sort of, that's symbolic of this or blah, blah, blah. No, what it says is that people like Lazarus, right, got up out of tombs and walked out after they had died, right? And notice it says many bodies of the saints, and that prefigures his resurrection and the second coming. And so that's the point, is that it's to show you Jesus can accomplish resurrection, right? And so you have some people who are then resurrected, and it shows that, right? When those people get up and go back to town or go back to their homes, it's like, oh my goodness. Well, that's one of the things that happens as a consequence of Jesus's death, is it foreshadows that he is definitely telling the truth when he talks about resurrection. And then, of course, he's resurrected in 3 days. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.